When Napoleon's ships landed on the shores of Egypt in 1798, it was not simply another military campaign in the long history of wars and conquests that the Muslim Ummah had witnessed before. Rather, it was an unexpected and deeply unsettling intrusion that shook the very foundations of how Muslims viewed themselves and their place in the world. For centuries, the lands of Islam had been accustomed to invasions, whether from Mongols, Crusaders, or neighboring rival powers, but this event was different in its nature and in its psychological impact. It was sudden, it was precise, and it was carried out by a people who were not traditionally seen as a great threat to the Ummah. For the average Muslim of that time, the Western European nations were thought of as peripheral, distant, and relatively insignificant compared to the might of the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal dominion, or the Persian dynasties. The reality that a Western general could land, establish authority, and confront the Muslims directly was unimaginable until it actually happened before their very eyes. The arrival of Napoleon shattered this illusion of security and dominance that had persisted for centuries. The Ummah had grown used to believing that it was still the center of power, that Islamic civilization, though weakened politically, still commanded respect globally. Yet the invasion revealed cracks in that narrative. Suddenly, the Muslim world had to confront an uncomfortable truth: the balance of power had shifted, and the Ummah was no longer the unrivaled civilization it once claimed to be. This was not just an army setting foot on foreign soil. It was an entire worldview announcing its arrival. The cannons that roared in Egypt echoed far beyond the battlefield. They echoed in the hearts of Muslims from Cairo to Damascus, from Istanbul to Delhi, warning them that something had changed forever. It was not merely the physical defeat that shocked the Muslims, but the swiftness and efficiency with which the French forces established themselves. Here was a European army crossing vast seas with advanced weaponry, disciplined troops, and a strategy that demonstrated careful planning and confidence. The Muslim powers, accustomed to older modes of warfare, found themselves unable to respond with equal speed and coordination. This disparity became evident not only in the field but also in the reactions of rulers and scholars who struggled to process what had just occurred. It was a moment of disorientation, like suddenly waking up to realize that the world you thought you controlled was no longer yours to command. The shock also stemmed from the arrogance and boldness with which Napoleon declared his intentions. He did not arrive as a humble guest or cautious invader. He proclaimed himself as a liberator, appealing directly to the people, claiming to respect their faith while at the same time undermining their rulers. Such rhetoric was confusing and manipulative, and yet it revealed something Muslims were not accustomed to: a foreign general using psychological tactics, propaganda, and diplomacy alongside military might. The sudden arrival of this foreign power was not only physical but also ideological, leaving the Ummah uncertain about how to respond on multiple fronts. This moment forced Muslims to realize that the age of assuming unchallenged superiority was over. For too long, many had lived with the comfort of their glorious past, the days when Baghdad was the center of knowledge, when Andalusia illuminated Europe, when scholars, scientists, and jurists set the intellectual agenda of the world. But now, in an instant, the illusion that this legacy alone would protect them collapsed. The world had moved forward, and the Ummah had not kept pace. Napoleon's arrival in Egypt was therefore like a mirror held up before a sleeping giant, exposing its vulnerabilities and demanding an awakening. The sudden presence of a European power in the heart of the Muslim world was not just a political event, it was a civilizational shock that pierced the pride of an Ummah still clinging to the memory of its past dominance. The invasion of Egypt was not simply a matter of military conquest or the capturing of territory, it represented something far deeper: a confrontation between two worlds that had been developing along different trajectories for centuries. On one side was the Muslim Ummah, a civilization that had once led humanity in knowledge, art, and governance, carrying the banner of revelation and intellect together. On the other side was a Europe that had undergone the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution, now equipped with new weapons, new methods of organization, and a renewed sense of destiny. When Napoleon's forces landed in Egypt, it was not just armies that clashed, but visions of civilization, values, and worldviews colliding in a manner that was both startling and unavoidable. For the Muslims of the time, their worldview was shaped by centuries of scholarship, by the madrasas and mosques, by the rhythm of religious practice and the authority of tradition. They viewed themselves as the guardians of divine truth and as the inheritors of a glorious legacy. Yet, standing against Napoleon's forces, they suddenly encountered an enemy who operated according to an entirely different paradigm. The French came armed not only with cannons and rifles but with the discipline of modern armies, the strategies of trained generals, and the knowledge of scientists and engineers who accompanied them. The Muslim soldiers and scholars looked at this with astonishment, for it was a demonstration of how far the balance of progress had shifted. The clash was therefore not limited to the battlefield. It extended into the realm of ideas, into the awareness that the European civilization had built for itself tools of power that the Muslim world had neglected. When French soldiers marched in disciplined ranks, using firearms with deadly precision, the traditional methods of cavalry and sword seemed suddenly outdated. When French scientists mapped the land, studied its resources, and documented its people, it revealed a type of systematic knowledge that Muslims once pioneered but had now fallen behind in. This encounter forced Muslims to see that the superiority they had once taken for granted was no longer theirs to claim, and that a new power had emerged on the stage of history. What made this clash even more striking was the confidence with which Napoleon positioned himself. He did not arrive timidly, nor did he seek to only plunder and retreat. He came with a vision, declaring himself as a force of liberation, speaking directly to the people of Egypt, attempting to win their hearts even as he subdued their rulers. This was a new type of invasion, where propaganda and ideology marched alongside muskets and artillery. It was bewildering for the Muslim Ummah to see an invader who spoke of respecting Islam, who printed proclamations in Arabic, and who presented himself not only as a conqueror but as someone who understood the language of power, faith, and persuasion. This dual approach left many confused, for they were used to invaders who either fought them openly or sought only material gain, not one who combined military aggression with calculated diplomacy. This clash of civilizations also highlighted the inner stagnation that had taken root in much of the Muslim world. For centuries, internal struggles, political divisions, and reliance on outdated methods had weakened the unity and vigor of the Ummah. When faced with Napoleon's forces, these weaknesses became painfully obvious. The Muslims possessed faith and courage, but they lacked the organizational strength and technological advantage that their adversaries wielded. The clash therefore became symbolic, a moment where the Ummah could no longer ignore its own decline. It was as if the French presence exposed wounds that had long been hidden, forcing Muslims to confront a reality they had been reluctant to face. The most painful part of this encounter was the realization that the legacy of knowledge and advancement that once belonged to the Ummah had now shifted to the very people who were standing against them. The very sciences, philosophies, and systems of organization that Europe had borrowed and learned from the Muslims centuries earlier had now been refined and developed to a point where they were being used against the Ummah itself. This inversion of roles was deeply unsettling, for it was not just a defeat in war but a reversal of history. The clash was therefore not only political or military, it was a profound symbolic moment, where the Ummah saw its own past achievements reflected in the superiority of its adversaries, reminding it of what it had lost and what it needed to rediscover. The deeper wound of Napoleon's invasion was not only in the occupation of land or the loss of battles but in the intellectual and spiritual crisis it triggered within the Muslim Ummah. For centuries, Muslims had been secure in the belief that their civilization was anchored in divine guidance and that this spiritual certainty, combined with their historical legacy, guaranteed them superiority in the world. They had once been the pioneers of science, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, architecture, and literature. From Baghdad to Cordoba, from Damascus to Delhi, the Ummah had nurtured knowledge that the rest of the world had admired and sought to learn from. But when the French arrived with their fleets, their weapons, their disciplined armies, and even their scientists who meticulously documented the land and its people, Muslims were forced to face a reality that was as humiliating as it was shocking. The world had moved ahead, and they had remained stagnant. This intellectual crisis was perhaps more devastating than the military defeat itself. A battlefield loss could be explained away as temporary, as the result of poor strategy or unfortunate circumstances. But the deeper question that arose was one that pierced the heart of the Ummah's self-image. How could a community that once carried the banner of knowledge now be surpassed so decisively by those who were once its students? The very sciences that Muslim scholars had pioneered centuries before were now being wielded against them with devastating effectiveness. The telescope, the compass, the cannon, the printing press, these tools of progress had been ignored or resisted in many parts of the Muslim world, while Europe had embraced them, refined them, and turned them into instruments of dominance. The crisis, therefore, was not just about weapons and technology, but about identity and purpose. Scholars and thinkers of the time struggled to make sense of this new reality. For many, the question was not only why they had fallen behind but also whether their decline was a result of straying from their spiritual foundations or of neglecting the pursuit of worldly knowledge. Some interpreted the invasion as divine punishment, a wake-up call for the Ummah to return to the Quran and the Sunnah, to restore faith, discipline, and morality. Others saw it as evidence that Muslims had failed to engage with the changing world, that they had turned away from the spirit of inquiry, openness, and intellectual curiosity that had once defined the Islamic Golden Age. The tension between these two interpretations reflected the depth of the crisis, for the Ummah now had to wrestle with the difficult balance between spiritual revival and intellectual reform. Ordinary Muslims, too, felt the weight of this crisis. The sight of foreign soldiers marching confidently in their streets, the awareness of being governed by outsiders who spoke a different language and carried themselves with an air of superiority, all of this created a deep sense of humiliation. It was not just that their land was occupied but that their pride and dignity as a civilization were under assault. This humiliation became a silent wound, one that gnawed at the collective psyche of the Ummah, raising questions that had no easy answers. How had they allowed themselves to fall into such a state? What had gone wrong in their systems of governance, their approach to education, their understanding of faith and reason? The invasion turned into a mirror, reflecting back to them a painful truth they could no longer deny. The intellectual and spiritual crisis also exposed the absence of unity in the Muslim world. While Europe was moving towards greater consolidation, harnessing science and reason for power, the Ummah remained fragmented into competing dynasties, weakened by internal rivalries and unable to mount a unified response. Napoleon's success in Egypt highlighted not only the external strength of the West but also the internal weakness of the Muslims. This realization deepened the crisis, as Muslims recognized that without unity, without reform, and without reawakening both spiritually and intellectually, they would remain vulnerable to the advances of foreign powers. The crisis was therefore more than a temporary disturbance, it was the beginning of a long period of questioning, reflection, and painful awareness that the Ummah could no longer live on the glory of its past but had to rediscover the principles that had once made it great. Out of the humiliation and shock that came with Napoleon's invasion, there began to emerge something far more profound than mere resentment or despair. It was the stirring of an awakening, the painful birth of reform and reflection within the Muslim Ummah. For centuries, complacency had settled into the hearts of rulers and scholars alike. The glory of the past had been celebrated endlessly, yet little effort had been made to adapt to the changing currents of the world. When Napoleon's ships anchored on the shores of Egypt, when his cannons roared in Cairo, and when his proclamations were distributed in Arabic to the bewildered population, it was as though a harsh light had been cast upon a slumbering community, forcing them to open their eyes to the reality that could no longer be ignored. The Muslims realized that they were not merely defeated in a battle, but they were being defeated in knowledge, in organization, in technology, and in the systems that define civilization itself. This realization gave rise to a wave of thinkers, leaders, and scholars who began asking the difficult questions that had long been avoided. Where did the Ummah go wrong? How had the community that once gave birth to the likes of Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, and Al-Khwarizmi become so dependent on outdated structures? How had the spirit of curiosity, exploration, and advancement that defined the golden age of Islam been replaced by stagnation and imitation? These questions were not easy to face, for they required admitting that decline had not come overnight but was the result of centuries of neglect, disunity, and resistance to change. Napoleon's invasion was like a mirror reflecting back the truth that Muslims had long avoided confronting, and this painful honesty became the foundation for reformist thought. In the aftermath of this humiliation, there arose a sense of urgency among certain leaders and scholars to rethink the trajectory of the Ummah. Some argued for a return to the core values of Islam, not merely in ritual or superficial form, but in the deeper sense of embracing the Quran as a guide for renewal and the Sunnah as a framework for discipline, justice, and progress. Others emphasized the need to engage with the modern sciences, to once again become a people of learning, research, and discovery, as they had been centuries earlier. This tension between spiritual revival and intellectual reform did not weaken the awakening, rather, it enriched it, for both dimensions were necessary to restore balance and strength to the Ummah. Without faith, the community would lose its identity, and without knowledge, it would remain vulnerable to the very forces that had humiliated it. The reflection also extended into the realm of governance and political organization. Muslims saw with their own eyes how the French operated with efficiency, how discipline and order were maintained, and how authority was exercised in a manner that contrasted sharply with the corruption, inefficiency, and fragmentation that plagued many Muslim rulers at the time. The Ottoman Empire, though still vast in territory, was struggling with internal decay. The Mughals in India were shadows of their former glory. In Persia, instability had become the norm. Napoleon's invasion exposed these weaknesses in a single stroke, reminding Muslims that without strong and just leadership, their lands would continue to be vulnerable. Thus, reform was not only about books and sciences but also about how societies were governed, how justice was upheld, and how unity was preserved. This awakening was painful because it was born out of humiliation, yet it carried within it the seeds of revival. For many Muslims, the invasion became a turning point, a moment when they could no longer simply look back at the achievements of their ancestors with pride. Instead, they had to look forward and ask how those achievements could be reborn in their own time. Reform movements slowly began to take shape across the Muslim world, with scholars, preachers, and activists calling for both a spiritual cleansing and an intellectual rejuvenation. Napoleon's invasion may have been short-lived in its political presence, but its psychological and intellectual impact endured, serving as a reminder that the Ummah could not afford to remain stagnant. It had to reform, it had to reflect, and it had to reclaim its rightful place in the world by reconnecting with both its spiritual roots and its lost tradition of learning. Paradoxically, what Napoleon's invasion did for the Muslim Ummah was not only to humiliate it but also to remind it of its forgotten strength and buried potential. For centuries, Muslims had lived under the shadow of their glorious past, invoking the memory of their ancestors who had once illuminated the world with knowledge, justice, and power. Yet those memories had become distant echoes, often repeated in poetry, sermons, and gatherings, but no longer reflected in the lived reality of the Ummah. When Napoleon's forces marched into Egypt with their weapons, their organization, and their strange blend of science and military discipline, Muslims were shaken not simply because of their defeat, but because they recognized in the French many of the qualities that had once belonged to them. It was as though history itself was reminding them, "You were once the torchbearers of civilization, the leaders of humanity, the ones who inspired the very people now standing over you." The shock of seeing the French arrive with scientists, engineers, and scholars alongside their soldiers reminded Muslims of their own forgotten legacy. It was not so long ago in historical terms that Muslim cities had been the centers of intellectual brilliance, attracting students from across the world to learn mathematics in Baghdad, astronomy in Damascus, medicine in Cairo, and philosophy in Cordoba. It was the Muslim Ummah that had preserved Greek knowledge, added to it, and passed it on to Europe. It was Muslim scholars who had introduced the scientific method, algebra, optics, and the very foundations of modern chemistry and medicine. To see the descendants of those who once learned from the Ummah now arriving with advancements and power of their own was a painful reversal, but it also sparked a realization: this is not beyond us, for we were once the masters of it ourselves. This realization became a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was humiliating to see how far the Ummah had fallen from its former heights. On the other, it was motivating, for it showed that what Europe had achieved was not an alien path, not something impossible or unattainable, but a continuation of what Muslims themselves had pioneered. The French did not invent the pursuit of knowledge from nothing, they had built upon the foundations that Muslim scholars had laid. In this way, Napoleon's invasion became not only a wound but also a call to memory, a reminder that the Ummah possessed within its heritage the keys to renewal, should it choose to use them. It was as though the invasion shook off the dust of forgetfulness and forced the Muslims to look again at who they were meant to be. The reminder was not limited to the intellectual sphere. Spiritually, too, Muslims were reminded of their forgotten strength. For many, the humiliation of being ruled, even temporarily, by a foreign power rekindled their awareness of what it meant to truly rely on Allah, to turn back to the Quran and Sunnah with sincerity, and to rediscover the values of discipline, unity, and sacrifice. The invasion reminded them that power was never guaranteed, that Allah's support came with responsibility, and that neglecting both faith and action led inevitably to decline. This spiritual awakening was not immediate or universal, but it planted seeds within the hearts of individuals who would later call for renewal, reform, and a return to the authentic teachings of Islam, not as empty ritual but as a living force that could once again shape the destiny of the Ummah. In many ways, Napoleon's brief presence in Egypt was like a spark. It ignited conversations, writings, and reflections across the Muslim world. Scholars began to write about the need for both revival of faith and engagement with modern sciences. Leaders, though often still entrenched in old patterns, could no longer ignore the urgency of reform. Ordinary Muslims, humiliated by foreign dominance, began to look inward and remember that their ancestors had not been passive recipients of history but active makers of it. The reminder of their forgotten legacy did not immediately transform the Ummah, but it awakened a longing for dignity, a desire to rise once again, and a recognition that their fall was not permanent unless they chose to accept it as such. Napoleon's invasion, though brief, thus became a painful yet powerful reminder of what the Ummah had been, what it had lost, and what it still had the potential to reclaim. The lasting lesson of Napoleon's invasion was not contained merely in the months and years of French presence in Egypt but in the enduring awareness it left imprinted upon the entire Muslim Ummah. Empires rise and fall, armies come and go, but there are moments in history that leave a scar so deep that they alter the trajectory of entire civilizations. Napoleon's incursion was one of those moments. It revealed to Muslims with brutal clarity that the world had entered a new age, one in which power was not inherited simply by holding on to tradition or boasting of a glorious past, but rather earned through discipline, unity, knowledge, and foresight. The lesson that remained long after the French departed was that strength could not be assumed, it had to be cultivated, defended, and renewed in every generation. For centuries, the Ummah had relied on the momentum of its earlier triumphs. The legacy of Andalusia, Baghdad, Damascus, and Istanbul created a sense of superiority that many believed was unshakable. Yet Napoleon's landing in Egypt showed that even the strongest legacies could wither if not nurtured. The cannons that roared in Cairo were not only weapons of war, they were symbols of how far Europe had advanced while the Muslim world had stagnated. The lesson was stark: knowledge unused becomes obsolete, power unguarded becomes fragile, and unity neglected becomes weakness. The French did not defeat the Ummah solely because of their strength, they succeeded because the Muslims had allowed their own strength to decay. The lesson also extended into the realm of leadership and governance. Napoleon's invasion exposed how divided and disorganized much of the Muslim world had become. Corruption among rulers, rivalries between dynasties, and a lack of coordinated defense made it easy for a foreign power to establish itself. The French, despite being strangers in a foreign land, managed to impose authority swiftly because they operated with discipline and strategy, while Muslim leaders often acted with short-sightedness and self-interest. The Ummah realized that without justice, accountability, and competent leadership, even the most blessed of civilizations could fall into vulnerability. History was teaching them that leadership was not a privilege to be abused but a trust that determined the survival of an entire people. Perhaps the most profound lesson, however, was about the nature of true revival. The Muslims came to understand that the solution to their decline was not to mimic the West blindly, nor to cling uncritically to a romanticized past, but to strike a balance between rediscovering their authentic values and engaging meaningfully with the realities of the modern age. The French were powerful not simply because they had new weapons, but because they had embraced inquiry, experimentation, and organization, qualities that Muslims themselves had once pioneered. The Ummah saw that they could no longer remain in denial, assuming that the world would wait for them to awaken. They had to actively pursue knowledge once again, to cultivate unity, to reform governance, and to live by the principles of their faith in a way that inspired strength rather than passivity. The invasion of Napoleon, therefore, became a defining marker in history. Long after his soldiers left, the questions he forced upon the Muslims lingered. What does it mean to be a civilization of knowledge and faith? How does one reconcile tradition with progress? How can the Ummah reclaim dignity in a world that no longer grants respect by default? These were questions that would echo throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, shaping reform movements, educational initiatives, and even political struggles across the Muslim world. The French departure did not erase the memory of their presence. Instead, it left behind a lesson etched into the collective consciousness of the Ummah, a lesson that power is never permanent unless it is renewed, that knowledge is the true weapon of strength, and that unity is the shield without which no community can withstand the storms of history.